In today's narrated PowerPoint, we will examine the rich history of clinical pastoral education and supervised ministry. As we look at the history of these components of pastoral training, we will see how the histories of each intersect, providing us with an understanding of their parallels. From humble beginnings to the sophisticated framework we recognize today, our look will navigate us through the milestones, influential figures, and historical moments that have shaped the landscape of clinical pastoral education and supervised ministry. Clinical pastoral education and supervised ministry are both forms of practical training and education for individuals who are pursuing roles as pastors in some form of ministry. Clinical pastoral education is a specific form of supervised ministry. It focuses most on pastoral care within clinical or health care settings, while supervised ministry is a broader term that can encompass various contexts and responsibilities within the field. We'll be looking at both histories. However, I will put a spotlight on clinical pastoral education, and you'll see how the two dovetail together. Now, what should you learn? You will learn that in clinical pastoral education and supervised ministry, classroom was the dominant place where all instruction took place. You will learn supervised ministry that it began as a reaction against this traditional theological training. We will examine some of the personalities who were instrumental in launching the movement. We will look at the persons responsible for initiating clinical pastoral education and supervised ministry among Southern Baptists. And we will talk about the development of supervised ministry. Now let's look at clinical pastoral education from the perspective of its historical beginnings. Clinical pastoral education began in the United States in the early 20th century. It was a reaction against traditional academic theological education. In the early 20th century, when it was founded, traditional theological education happened in a classroom where theological problems were studied by reading textbooks and listening to lectures. Clinical pastoral education, on the other hand, brought students face to face with problems through the study of the living human document, not just textbooks. It is generally agreed that the founders of clinical pastoral education were William S. Keller, Richard C. Cabot, and Anton T. Boyson. On the next few slides, we will talk about these three founders of clinical pastoral education: William S. Keller, Richard C. Cabot, and Anton T. Boyson. Now, I couldn't find a picture of William Keller, so I decided to use this slide instead and just talk about a little of his life. Keller began teaching courses in pastoral, medical, and social work experience with supervision in Cincinnati in 1923. His programs included two of the basics of CPE, or clinical pastoral education. It included supervised clinical case studies, the forerunner to the verbatim, and the sense of process. The outbreak of World War II, however, ended much of his emphasis. Richard C. Cabot is the father of medical social work. It was in Boston that he made history by introducing social workers to supervision at the Massachusetts General Hospital in 1905. 20 years later, he confronted the theological educators of his day with the case for introducing a clinical year in theological studies for all theology students. Cabot's creed was that the only absolute need of the human soul is the need to grow, and to that end, he urged educators to develop what he called clinical theology, that is, a theology brought into the situation of suffering. Cabot pleaded for a professional model of theological education. He stressed competence in pastoral work and training in pastoral theology or clinical theology. He also was the teacher of Anton Boyson. Anton T. Boyson was a Presbyterian minister who later became a Congregationalist minister. Jokingly, he referred to himself as a Presbygationalist. He is typically referred to as the father of the modern clinical pastoral education movement. He experienced no less than 5 major psychotic experiences in his life. He was a schizophrenic, and he had at least 3 hospitalizations for this issue that he faced with mental illness. He engaged in a struggle to make sense of his own illness. He functioned professionally as a mental health chaplain, as a researcher, and as an organizer of clinical training for theological students. He became a chaplain at the Elgin State Hospital near Chicago, and there he organized the Chicago Council for the Clinical Training of Theological Students. In his work as a researcher, he sought to construct a clinical theology with the help of the living human document, while at the same time relentlessly pursuing his search for the meaning of religious experiences, especially the relationship between religious experiences and mental disorders. In 1926, he wrote about his method, theological training, and I quote him saying this, theological training for the future will be a continuous affair with the parish as the laboratory and a person with need the main concern. And the seminary is a clearinghouse of theological tradition and formation and the supervision of methods. The attention will be shifted from the past to the present, from books to the raw material of life. Close quotes. He pursued special studies in the essentials of case records for teaching purposes. Boyson started out with just a few students, and he moved forward with those students. More about that in just a moment. Boyson started off in 1925 with 5 theological students, and this marked the beginning of clinical pastoral education in the United States of America. One of his noteworthy books is entitled Exploration of the Inner World. Today, there are CPE centers on every continent, and the Association of Clinical Pastoral Education was formed in 1967. Wayne Oates was a professor of psychology of religion and pastoral care from 1947 to 1974 at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. He was born in Greenville, South Carolina in June of 1917. In 1957, Oates began a great movement of pastoral education among Southern Baptist churches. The Southern Baptist Association was developed in 1957 by Wayne Oates, who provided a climate for CPE at the Southern Baptist Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. Oates' careful scholarship and unswerving enthusiasm for pastoral care earned him a wide reputation for being a leader in the pastoral care field. Baptist leaders such as Wayne Oates, Richard Young, Edward Thornton, and others have insisted that pastoral care function as a theological foundation for education to strengthen and to correct theological knowledge. For Oates, learning focused on training workers for a ministry that affirms the Christian gospel and builds pastoral skills to relate to people suffering from problems with which the pastor will have to deal throughout his ministry. And now we come to the development of supervised ministry. You will remember supervised ministry is the overarching umbrella term that's used for all supervised types of ministry that takes place, such as clinical pastoral education. There are other names that are used to refer to supervised ministry. There is theological field education, internships, practicums, residency, apprenticeship, practical training, and mentored ministry. Today, every accredited theological seminary in the United States and Canada offers supervised ministry, but that's not always been the case. Charles R. Fielding's essay in 1966 entitled Education for Ministry convinced the American Association of Theological Schools of the necessity of including academically sound supervised ministry in the curriculum of seminaries as a part of their degree requirements. Fielding was a professor of pastoral theology in Trinity College in the University of Toronto. In 1957, Fielding co-founded the Toronto Institute for Pastoral Training with Dr. J. A. McFarland. Upon his resignation as Dean of the Divinity School in 1961, Fielding took a sabbatical. He was a visiting fellow at Yale University, and it was there that he began to do research on trends in church ministry education. This work would result in 1966 of a publication entitled Education for Ministry. He saw the tendency of the schools to replace the practice of ministry with lectures about the practice of ministry. This eventually led to the formation of the Association of Theological Field Education. In this new curriculum, they actually began to talk about a degree requirement to be associated with all theological degrees that would equip ministers to be able to do their work more effectively. It was a challenge that they would embrace to learn supervised ministry or to learn ministry under supervision. The history of supervised ministry and clinical pastoral education reveals a compelling narrative of growth, adaptation, and resilience. From the early experiments in the mid-20th century to the establishment of comprehensive programs today, we see an evolution of pastoral training that mirrors the changing landscape of health care, society, and spirituality. The intertwining of theory and practice and the emphasis on experiential learning have emerged as an enduring hallmark of these two disciplines. As we reflect on the founders who shaped these fields, it becomes evident that clinical pastoral education and supervised ministry have become integral pillars in nurturing empathetic, skilled, and spiritually grounded pastoral leaders. This ends today's presentation.